The Texas sun had a way of flattening sound. On certain summer afternoons it pressed the world down into a shimmering quiet, no wind, no rustle of mesquite, not even the low grumble of cattle. Just heat rising off the fields in long wavering ribbons. It was on such an afternoon in the unforgiving summer of 1944 that the Hartman farm reached its breaking point. The farm sat 12 miles outside of Abilene, too, weather-beaten barns, a sagging windmill, and acres of dry scrub that used to be cotton fields before the war drained the land of hands to work it. The eldest son, Thomas Hartman, had shipped out with the 36th Infantry Division the year before. The younger boy, Jacob, had gone north to work in an aircraft factory in Wichita Falls. That left only their father, Henry Hartman, 57, stiff-backed, stubborn, and already stooped from a lifetime behind a plow. Henry stood alone beside the irrigation ditch that afternoon, his boots sinking into the cracked earth. The ditch was nothing more than a trench of dust now choked by months of drought. The water pump sat silent, its engine refusing to turn over, its belts sagging like old leather reins. He wiped the sweat from his brow and inspected the wiring again, a tangled, brittle mess chewed by months of heat and neglect. "Damn thing's dead," he muttered, voice swallowed by the stillness. Without the pump, the cotton wooden tee survived the week. And without the crop, the farm was finished. He had no sons at home. The neighbors were in the same bind. Every healthy pair of hands was overseas or in a uniformed job. The war had hollowed out rural Texas, leaving behind empty fields and men too old to fill them. A faint sound broke the silence, an engine distant but steady. Henry squinted toward the dirt road. A U.S. Army truck rolled into view, dust billowing behind it. In its canvas-shaded bed sat a dozen young men in sun-faded khaki uniforms. But these weren't American boys. The letters stenciled on their shirts, PW, made that clear enough. German prisoners of war. Fresh arrivals from Camp Berkeley, sent out to local farms by the Army's agricultural labor program. Henry took off his hat as the truck pulled to a halt. The driver, a stocky MP with a sunburned neck, hopped down and wiped his forehead. "Afternoon, Mr. Hartman," he said. "We brought your detail." Henry glanced at the prisoners, most no older than his own sons. Blonde hair, brown hair, dark eyes, pale eyes. Dust-covered boots. Lean from marching, tired from war. One of them sat apart from the others, elbows on his knees, studying the farm with the quiet attention of someone trying to understand a landscape far from home. He couldn't have been more than 22. A narrow face, wire-rimmed glasses, and the posture of someone used to tinkering with machinery. The MP pointed at him. "That one speaks the best English." Henry frowned. "Don't need talk, need work." The MP chuckled. "Work is what they here for." The prisoners climbed down in orderly fashion, forming a line. The man with the glasses stepped forward. He raised a hand in a polite, almost timid greeting. "My name is Carl Weber," he said, accent light but unmistakable. "We will work where you need us." Henry nodded, though he didn't meet the young man's eyes. He was not cruel, he simply didn't know what to do with the idea of enemy soldiers standing in the soil his sons had grown up on. He pointed at the broken pump. "You know engines." Carl studied it, then crouched to inspect the wiring. His expression tightened, something halfway between amusement and disbelief. "This wiring." He looked back at Henry. "It is, how do you say, very stupid." The MP winced. Henry stiffened. Carl immediately straightened. I am sorry. I do not mean insult. I mean dangerous, wrong connections, wrong materials, very old." Henry crossed his arms. "Can you fix it?" Carl hesitated, as though weighing the risks of speaking plainly. Then he nodded. "Yes, I think so, but I need wire. Proper wire." Henry exhaled. "All I've got is in the shed." Carl followed him. Inside, the air smelled of oil dust and old iron. The shed held tools from 3 generations, some sharp, many dull, all worn. Henry rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a spool of fencing wire. Carl blinked. "This is for cattle. It's all there is," Henry said. Carl looked at the pump again, then at the wire. His shoulders lowered, defeated. This is not right for electricity. Henry's voice was flat. Then we redone here. Carl swallowed. His jaw tightened. He looked out at the dry fields, at the people still fighting their own war against the land. Then he nodded, resigned. I will try, he said softly. But this will be creative. The MP laughed. Henry didn't he? The sun beat down. Sweat trickled. Dust rose with every step. And as Carl crouched beside the pump, unwinding the cheap fencing wire, it was clear this wasn't just a repair. It was an act of desperation on both sides of the war, and so began the strange, improbable story of a German POW, an old Texas farmer, and a stupid wire trick that would change both their lives. Night fell slowly over the Texas plains, as it always did, first softening the horizon, then erasing it altogether. By the time the sky turned a deep indigo, the Hartman farm had grown quiet again. The German work detachment had been taken back to Camp Barkley in the rumbling army truck. The dust from their departure still hung faintly in the air, drifting through the twilight, like the remnants of some long-ago cavalry patrol. But Henry Hartman remained by the irrigation pump, long after they were gone, turning over the day's events in silence. The fencing wire lay coiled at his feet like a discarded snake, and the improvised connections Carl had made shimmered faintly in the lantern light. Henry crouched and ran a calloused finger along the new wiring. It looked wrong, too thin, too brittle, too improvised. But then again, war made improvisation the only craft most men had left. He straightened and looked out across the fields. Once these lands had thrived under careful irrigation, cotton swaying in the wind like pale green waves. Now the rows were stunted, thirsty, and still. Henry rubbed the ache in his lower back, feeling the weight of each empty day the war had taken from him. Inside the farmhouse, the radio crackled with another distant broadcast. London reports, Normandy updates, casualty lists. Somewhere across an ocean, one of his sons might be hearing the same news, or might already be beyond hearing it. Henry closed his eyes, listening to the murmur of voices he couldn't quite make out. For a moment he thought he heard Thomas's voice in the static, but that was only memory playing tricks. That same night, 15 miles away, Camp Barkley hummed with a different kind of activity. Floodlights cast stark shadows across the barbed wire fences. Guard towers stood like skeletal sentinels under a half-moon. And in the long wooden barracks where the German prisoners slept, the day's events were still being discussed in low, cautious voices. Carl Weber sat at the edge of his bunk, carefully removing his spectacles and wiping the dust from their lenses. He polished them with slow, deliberate motions, anything to quiet the thoughts swirling within him. The barracks smelled of pine boards, canvas cots, and the faint, metallic tang of laundry soap the army issued for their uniforms. Across the aisle, a burly prisoner named Otto watched him with mild amusement. "You look like a professor after a long day at the chalkboard," he said. Carl smiled faintly. "A mechanic after a long day in the sun, maybe." Otto snorted. "You were a mechanic in civilian life?" Carl hesitated. "Apprentice mostly. My father had a workshop. Engines, wiring, radios, small things. Small things can become big things," Otto muttered, pulling off his boots. "They made us lose a war once before." Carl didn't respond. He folded his spectacles, set them beside his cot, and lay back. The ceiling boards above him glowed faintly in the dim lights. Outside, he could hear the rhythmic footsteps of an MP pacing near the fence line. A reminder of where he was. A reminder that anything he did, even fixing a pump, might be seen with suspicion. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in Stuttgart in his father's shop. The smell of varnish and copper wire. The clatter of tools. His father hunched over a half-assembled radio, explaining the importance of connection, how a machine was nothing more than a series of bonds, each relying on the others. If one fails, his father had said, they all fail. Machines have no loyalty, only logic. Carl had believed that once. War had taught him otherwise. The next morning, the army truck returned, raising a storm of dust along the empty road. Henry stood beside the pump again, inspecting the wires. Dew clung to them like tiny beads of silver. They looked delicate, almost fragile in the early light. The MP hopped out and waved, ready for round two. Henry nodded but kept his eyes on the prisoners as they climbed down. He watched Carl closely, watched the way the young man approached the pump with careful, almost reverent steps, as though he were approaching a wounded animal. Carl knelt to inspect the connections, his brow furrowed. "You did not turn it on last night," he said. "Didn't he plan to?" Henry replied. "Not until you were here. Don't he trust a thing about this setup?" Carl's expression tightened. He was trying not to show offense. He simply nodded. "That is wise." He wiped the dew from the wires gently, then signaled for Otto and two others to hold the wooden frame steady. Henry folded his arms. "So what exactly did you do yesterday? I watched you, but I didn't understand half of it." Carl took a slow breath. The belts were fine. The engine was strong, but the wiring, it was wrong. Whoever fixed it before used whatever they could find. Some wires were for telephone lines. Some were for lamps. Some were barely wires at all. Henry grunted. "Folks been making do since before the war. I know," Carl said softly, "and I do not judge it. War makes all men use what they have." He paused, glancing at the fencing wire. "But electricity does not make such compromises. It behaves as it must." Henry didn't respond. He watched as Carl tightened the last connection. "Now," Carl said, stepping back, "you may try it." The MP raised an eyebrow. Henry hesitated. The pump had not run in months. Turning it on now felt like gambling the last of his hope. But he reached for the ignition anyway. His fingers trembled just slightly as he pressed the switch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a cough like a tired old mule, the engine sputtered, shuddered, grumbled, the belts twitched, the wires hummed, the engine roared to life. Water surged through the pipe, forcing out a cloud of dust before finally spilling clean, cold, and very real into the irrigation ditch. Carl stepped back as the water flowed, his face unreadable. Otto whooped. The other prisoners murmured in relief. Henry stared at the stream as though it were a miracle. The pump worked. The field would live. The farm would survive, at least for now. He looked at Carl with something he hadn't felt toward a German in years. Respect, but war had a way of creeping into even the smallest, quietest corners of life. Word would soon spread among neighbors, among the guards, among officers, that a German prisoner had repaired an American lifeline with a trick of improvised wire. Some would scoff. Some would question his motives. Some would accuse him of sabotage in disguise. And soon enough, the real test of loyalty on both sides of the barbed wire would begin. The morning after the pump sputtered back to life, the fields shimmered with something they had not known in months' movement. Water trickled down the trenches, darkening the thirsty soil. The cotton leaves lifted themselves toward the sun as if waking from a long sleep. Even the cattle lingered near the flowing ditch, listening to the sound of the pump's steady heartbeat. For Henry Hartman, the sight brought a relief he hadn't allowed himself to feel since his sons left home. But it was a cautious relief shaded by unease. A machine repaired is one thing. A machine repaired by an enemy soldier, by a boy young enough to be his own son, was another thing entirely. And that unease grew the moment his neighbor pulled up in a dusty Chevrolet truck around mid-morning. Amos Klein, short, red, faced, suspicious by nature. He stepped out, planting his boots in the dirt with the confidence of a man who trusted neither strangers nor good fortune. "Morning, Henry," he called, adjusting his hat. "Heard your pump running again." Henry wiped his hands on a rag. "That's right. Wife says she heard it all the way from our place." Amos squinted at the ditch. "Sure is flowing." Henry nodded stiffly. He knew what was coming. "So," Amos said, stepping closer, "folks are saying a German fixed it. Henry hesitated. A prisoner from Berkeley. They sent a work detail, and you let him near your machinery. Amos shook his head slowly. Henry, you know better. Those boys fought our boys. Some still might be fighting 'em if the war hasn't had its final say. Henry didn't meet his eyes. He knew what he was doing. Amos scoffed, or he knew how to break it worse later. Henry's jaw tightened. Water's flowing isn't it? For now, Amos said quietly, but you keep your guard up. He tipped his hat and walked back to his truck, leaving dust swirling in his wake. Henry watched him go, a knot forming in his chest. He wanted to dismiss the suspicion, wanted to believe Carl's hands were guided by skill, not sabotage. But years of wartime, newsreels of casualty, reports of telegrams arriving on ranch porches across Taylor County, those things left shadows that no flowing water could wash away. He turned back toward the pump. Carl was standing near the ditch with 2 other prisoners helping shovel debris from the waterway. They worked in silence, moving with the steady rhythm of men accustomed to hard labor. Carl moved slower than the others, not from weakness, but from a carefulness that suggested he was always thinking one step ahead. Henry approached him, boots crunching on the drying earth. You did good work, he said quietly. Carl straightened, brushing dust from his trousers. Thank you, sir, but tell me something. Henry's voice dropped. Why do you really fix it? That pump is the only thing keeping this farm alive. If you wanted to do harm, you could have walked away from it. Carl blinked behind his spectacles. Do you think that is what I want? Henry's silence answered for him. Carl took a slow breath. I understand the suspicion, truly, but I fixed it because it was broken. And because a field that dies helps no one. Henry studied him for a long moment. The windmill creaked in the soft breeze. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding across the soil. Where do you learn engines? Henry finally asked. Carl looked down at his hands, long-fingered, calloused, stained faintly by oil and copper. My father had a workshop in Stuttgart, he said, before the war. He taught me everything about engines, radios, wiring. We repaired bicycles, tractor motors, generators, anything that came to our door. Henry nodded, and then the war came. Carl's voice grew quiet. Yes, and everything that was small became swallowed by something very large. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That afternoon during the prisoner's break, Carl sat alone near the barn, sketching something in the dirt with a small stick. Henry watched from a distance. At first it appeared to be some kind of diagram of motor gears wiring paths. As he looked closer, he realized it wasn't machinery at all. It was a map, a rough drawing of Germany. Carl paused when he saw Henry watching. He brushed the dirt smooth with his boot. You trying to find your way home? Henry asked gruffly. Carl shook his head, just remembering it. Sometimes if I draw it I can see it better. He offered a faint smile. Prison walls are not just made of wood and wire, Mr. Hartman. They are also made of distance. Something in his tone made Henry's chest tighten. It was the same tone he had heard from soldiers returning from camp, from widows at church, from men who received telegrams bearing the cold phrase, "We regret to inform you." Loneliness was its own battlefield. "Where is your mother?" Henry asked. "Home," Carl said. "She writes when she can, but letters travel slowly now, and your father," Carl hesitated. "I do not know. He didn't have to say the rest. War was a thief of certainties." Late in the day, the army truck rumbled back down the road. The prisoners climbed aboard one by one, their boots thudding on the wooden bed. Carl was the last to climb up. Before he did, he turned to Henry. "If the pump fails again," he said gently, "tell them to send me, not anyone else." Henry frowned. "Why?" Carl touched the frame of his spectacles. "Because I know exactly how it was repaired. And because your wire—" He hesitated, searching for the right English word. "Is not something another mechanic will understand." Henry almost smiled. "Almost. You still think it is stupid?" Carl's face softened. "I think it is brave. You make war with what you have, and peace too." The MP banged on the side of the truck. Carl climbed aboard. The engine growled to life. Henry stood in the cloud of dust long after the truck was gone, thinking about the strange young man who had stepped across an invisible border between enemy and neighbor. He didn't know what the coming days would bring. But he knew one thing: a German POW had saved his farm, and not everyone in Taylor County would be glad for it. Because in 1944, even on quiet Texas soil, the war was never just overseas. It lived in the spaces between men. In suspicion, in memory, in the fragile hope of a repaired machine, and soon enough that quiet war would sharpen, and it would test Carl far beyond a simple pump. The storm rolled in without warning. Not the kind that brought rain. Texas hadn't seen a real storm in months, but the kind that carried heat, lightning, and a strange restless wind that skittered across the dry soil like something alive. By dusk, the sky pulsed with distant flashes. Shadows rippled over the Hartman farm. The livestock paced in uneasy circles. Henry Hartman stood on his porch, hands resting on the railing, eyes fixed on the horizon. Something felt wrong. It was a sensation. He trusted the sense a farmer gets after decades of studying skies, seasons, and the stubborn weight of silence. Then he heard it, a change in the air, a subtle shift in the fields, a faint slowing of a sound he had come to depend on. The pump's voice, steady all day, began to falter. Henry moved quickly down the steps. His boots struck the dirt with urgency. The sky flashed again, illuminating the cotton rows in ghostly whites. When he reached the ditch, he found the flow weaker, sputtering. The belts trembled. The engine coughed like a smoker in a winter hospital. And then, with a final choking gasp, the pump died. The silence after was worse than any thunder. Henry stared at the machine, heart sinking. His first thought was mechanical belts, fuel wire. His second thought, unbidden but sharp, came from the warnings of neighbors and radio newsreels. Sabotage. He immediately hated the thought, but it clung to him. The war had trained a generation of Americans to expect treachery from anyone with the wrong uniform, the wrong accent. He knelt beside the wires. Some of them looked shifted, lifted slightly from the dirt. And the fencing wire Carl had used, it was warm to the touch, hotter than it should have been. A storm crackled across the sky, throwing white light over the dry earth. No, Henry muttered, no, not that boy. But suspicion is a wildfire. Once it sparks, it feeds on everything in its path. Morning brought no relief. The heat returned with merciless clarity, and with it came whispers from the nearby farms. They arrived in the form of truck tires on dirt roads, boots on porches, and voices lowered to meaningful tones. Amos Klein arrived again, jaw set like stone. Heard the pump quit, he said. Henry didn't answer. I warned you, Amos continued. Those German boys pretend real well. They polite, quiet, helpful, but they soldiers, Henry. Soldiers do what they retrained to do. Sabotage ain't a stranger to them. Henry forced the words out. It might just be the wire. It wasn't meant for this, or he wasn't meant for this farm, Amos snapped. You got too close to that boy. You start seeing him like some lost puppy instead of what he is. The accusation stung deeper than Henry wanted to admit. Before he could reply, the army truck appeared at the end of the road, dust cloud trailing like a storm front. It rolled to a stop, and the MP stepped down with a different posture than previous days, rigid, alert. Mr. Hartman, he called out. Henry approached wary. Sir, the MP said we received a report that your pump failed overnight. HQ wants us to check for irregular activity. Amos folded his arms smugly. Henry's stomach twisted. What sort of irregular activity? The MP didn't mince words. Sabotage, prisoner tampering, interference with critical civilian equipment. Henry glared at Amos. You didn't someone had to say something, Amos replied. The prisoners climbed down from the truck, their faces confused. Carl was among them, adjusting his spectacles nervously as the MP addressed him. Weber stepped forward. Carl obeyed, hands trembling slightly. Mr. Hartman, the MP said, you may question him if you like. Henry stared at Carl. He wanted to find anger, betrayal, guilt, but all he saw was fear, quiet, exhausted fear. Carl swallowed. Is something wrong with the pump? Henry hesitated. Words felt heavy. It stopped last night, he finally said. Just after sundown. Carl's face fell. I told you the wire was not proper. It might fail under too much load. That's convenient, Amos muttered. Carl turned to him, hurt but restrained. Sir, I have no reason to harm this farm. What good would that do? I sleep behind barbed wire. You do not. The MP stepped between them. Weber, did you tamper with it after hours? No, Carl said quickly. We are locked in the compound. We have no way to leave. Henry knew that was true. Camp Berkeley was strict. Night escape was nearly impossible. And Carl didn't strike him as someone who would attempt it. But suspicion, Amos's suspicion, the town's whispering suspicion, hung in the air like a noose. Then you'll fix it again, the MP said, under supervision. Carl nodded once. If Mr. Hartman permits. The MP turned to Henry. Sir, Henry exhaled. Let him try. They walked together to the pump. The prisoners followed at a distance. The cotton leaves rustled faintly. Carl knelt by the wiring, eyes narrowing with focus. Something changed, he said softly. These connections, they were moved. Henry's pulse quickened. Moved by who? Carl didn't answer. He adjusted one wire, then another. His hands grew still. This was pulled loose, he whispered. Not by accident. Behind them, Amos smirked. There's your proof. But Carl shook his head. No. Look at the ground. No footprints. No scuffs. No displaced dust. A saboteur would leave marks. Someone would have to kneel, but there is nothing. Henry crouched beside him. He saw it too, perfectly still dust beneath the pump. No signs of tampering. Then what happened? Henry asked. Carl touched the fencing wire with 2 fingers, then jerked them back. The heat, the load was too high yesterday. The wire overheated, expanded. It slid out of its own tension. He looked at Henry, earnest and ashamed. This repair was always temporary. I meant to fortify it today. Amos opened his mouth, but the MP silenced him. Could it be sabotage? He asked quietly. Carl shook his head. If someone wanted to ruin it, they would cut the belt, smash the pistons, break the engine, not loosen a wire with no marks. Henry felt his shoulders loosen. The suspicion began to melt. Not entirely, but enough. Can you fix it? Henry asked. Carl nodded slowly. Yes, but not with this wire. He looked directly at the MP. I need proper material. Real copper, real insulation, a length of conduit. If you want this farm to survive, and if you want no more accidents, you must allow me those things. The MP hesitated. Rules were strict. Supplies were limited. But the war had taught him something too. When a man tries to break something, he leaves disorder. When he tries to save something, his hands move with purpose. The MP finally nodded. I'll get you what you need. Amos threw up his hands in disgust. You re-trusting him? The MP glared. I've seen real sabotage. This isn't it. Henry looked at Carl as the prisoners gathered their tools. The young German seemed smaller now, worn down not by guilt, but by the weight of proving himself innocent in a land that didn't owe him trust. Go on, Henry said softly. Fix it. Proper this time. Carl nodded, once relief flickering behind his tired eyes. And so on that strange storm-lit morning in 1944, a German prisoner prepared to save a Texas farm not once, but twice, this time with the war itself watching every movement of his hands. The army truck returned 2 hours after sunrise, carrying fewer men but more equipment. In the back lay a spool of proper copper wire, a box of ceramic insulators, a battered toolbox stamped U.S. Engineer Corps, and 3 lengths of metal conduit scavenged from a repair depot on the edge of Camp Berkeley. It wasn't much, but to Carl it was treasure. As the prisoners filed out, Henry noticed the difference in their demeanor. They walked not with the sullen resignation of men forced into labor, but with the alert stiffness of soldiers aware they were operating under scrutiny. The rumors of sabotage had spread through the camp. Even the guard's eyes were sharper today. Carl stepped down last, the sunlight glinting off his spectacles. He approached Henry and the MP with quiet resolve. This time, he said, "We do it correctly." Henry nodded. It was the closest he could come to telling the young man he trusted him. The broken pump sat in the center of the field like a wounded sentinel. The storm from the previous night had left the soil brushed with a thin layer of dust, and the irrigation ditch lay still and shallow, waiting for salvation. Carl knelt beside the pump, unrolling the copper wire across his lap. Otto and two others stood behind him, ready with tools. Henry watched, hat in hand. The MP stood a few paces back, rifle slung loosely across his shoulder, not in threat, but in formality. "Remove all the old wire," Carl instructed. Otto grinned with pleasure. The fencing wire came away easily, brittle and discolored from heat. It snapped in places like dry twigs. Carl examined a piece and shook his head. "This was never meant for electricity," he murmured. "It is a miracle it lasted even a day." Henry exhaled slowly. "Then let us hope miracles aren't needed this time." Carl looked up at him. "No, sir. This time it will be craft." They worked in the rising heat, daylight, turning the farmyard into an anvil. Sweat darkened their shirts. Dust stuck to their skin. But the work was steady, deliberate, almost gentle. Carl threaded the copper wire through the metal conduit and secured the ends with ceramic insulators. He cleaned every contact point on the pump, removing old rust and residue. Each movement was precise, practiced like a man restoring not a machine but a memory of home. Henry watched every step. He wasn't checking for deception, he was learning. He found himself wanting to remember exactly how Carl's hands moved, how he arranged the wires, how he tightened the bolts. It reminded him of teaching his sons to fix a wagon wheel or mend a fence. At one point, he saw Carl wince as the hot metal touched his fingers. "You re-burning yourself," Henry said. Carl shrugged lightly. "It is only heat. It will pass." Henry reached for a pair of work gloves and tossed them to him. Carl caught them midair, surprised. "For the hands," Henry said gruffly. "You need them." Carl nodded and put the gloves on. "Dank." Henry pretended he didn't hear the German, but he did, and it didn't sting the way it once did. By noon, Carl stood and wiped his forehead. The copper wiring lay neatly encased, anchored by metal straps running from the pump's engine, housing to the ignition box like a clean, perfect vein. "If this fails," Carl said quietly, "the problem is not the wiring." Henry and the MP exchanged glances. "That's a confident statement," the MP said. Carl nodded. "I trust the work, and I trust the material." Henry stepped forward. "Then let us test it." The tension was palpable. Even the cattle had gathered near the fence, ears flicking in the heat. The prisoners backed away. Carl removed his gloves and folded his hands behind his back, as if preparing for a verdict. Henry reached for the switch. He paused, feeling an absurd urge to say something, a prayer, a hope, a promise, but no words came. Instead, he simply closed his hand around the ignition. Click. The engine groaned, coughed, shuddered. Then something different happened. It steadied. A deep, confident hum rose from the machine. The belts rotated smoothly, catching the sunlight. The pump drew breath like a man waking from a long fever, and then water surged. Not in a weak trickle like before, but in a strong, steady rush that filled the ditch in seconds. Cold water, pulled from deep beneath the earth, rippled down the trenches, cutting through the dust as though reclaiming land that had been waiting for its return. Henry let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The MP whistled softly. Otto slapped Carl on the back. The other prisoners smiled. Carl only stared at the flowing water, his face softened by quiet relief. "It will hold," he said. Henry stepped closer, eyes never leaving the water. "You saved it," he said, voice rough. "You saved the whole crop." Carl looked at him, hesitant. "Just a machine, Mr. Hartman." Henry shook his head. "You don't understand. This field, it has been in my family since before the Great War. My grandfather broke this soil. My father plowed it. My sons grew up in it." He turned to Carl, meeting his eyes. "And you brought it back?" Carl swallowed hard. His face tightened, not in pride, but in something like sorrow. A man his age shouldn't he have been so familiar with sorrow? Behind them, Amos Klein's truck rolled up. Amos stepped out, suspicion thick on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but when he saw the pump running strong, the wires perfectly laid, the water flowing, the prisoners standing in honest fatigue, he fell silent. For a moment even Amos couldn't summon the words. Henry faced him. "Still think he sabotaged it?" Amos looked at Carl, at the copper wiring at the ditch. "No," he muttered. "Looks like he fixed it proper." Henry nodded once. "That's right." Carl said nothing. He only folded his hands, gaze lowered, uncomfortable, being defended, unsure of his place. The MP clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work, son." Carl blinked. "Thank you, sir." Henry watched the exchange, feeling something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not forgiveness, not trust, but understanding. A German boy in Texas, an American farm saved, 2 wars fighting inside every man present, and for the first time the farm felt like a place where the war might loosen its grip. By late afternoon the water had reached every corner of the cotton rows. The leaves glistened. The soil, dark and rich again, released a faint earthy smell that made Henry's eyes sting. Carl and the prisoners climbed into the truck, their boots heavy with mud. As Carl placed a hand on the rail, Henry called out. "Carl," the young man turned. If you ever need anything while you're here, you tell me." Carl stared, surprised. Then he nodded slowly. "Thank you, mister." Hartman, the truck pulled away, leaving the dust swirling behind it. But for once that dust felt like nothing more than dust, not a cloud of doubt nor suspicion. Just the dirt of Texas settling after a long morning's work. The pump hummed on. The fields drank deeply. And the war, at least on one small farm, seemed to ease its hold.